Thing is starting now.
All right.
So,
should I take it away?
Yeah, that's great. I'll actually do an introduction first, Cameron.
Great.
And you can get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar from our Sustainable Tourism series. My name is Lee Hawkins. I'm the Climate Change Resilience Officer at the Whitsunday Climate Change Innovation Hub. And the Hub looks to build resilience of the Whitsundays and communities everywhere to climate change. Now, our sector, our tourism sector, is a crucial part of our economy, and building resilience in this sector is of huge importance to all of us. So before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this session and it will be available on the Whitsunday Climate Change Innovation Hub website. We are joined today by Cameron Balch, a principal consultant with EarthCheck, who has responsibilities in both the certification and consulting sides of the organisation. Cameron also has international experience working in government regulation with the US Environmental Protection Agency and community stakeholder engagement in the Philippines, developing their marine protected areas. Cameron's work has focused on overseeing the implementation of EarthCheck's Decarbonisation Framework for both corporates and local government authorities. He is also an expert in environmental, social and governance principles, holding a Level 1 Fundamentals of Sustainable Accounting credential from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Cameron is a graduate of the University of Queensland Business School, earning a Masters of Tourism, Hotel and Event Management degree, and his thesis investigated the methods used to measure sustainable tourism right around the world. So in today's webinar, Cameron will be providing an overview of recently completed sustainability projects that were undertaken on behalf of the Queensland Department of Environment and Science, targeting decarbonisation of islands of the Great Barrier Reef, and he will outline the significance that these results hold for the Whitsunday region. Cameron will provide a 20 to 25 minute presentation, and at the end of the presentation, I may have some questions for Cameron. We also have Olivia Broadhorst on this presentation as well. She's the coordinator of the hub. So welcome, Olivia. Microphones will be muted during the presentation. So if you haven't done so, could you please mute your microphones? You can also type questions in the chat if you've joined us late. And please turn off your video to ensure a better quality connection if you are having difficulties with that connection. So on that note, I think I'll hand it over to you, Cameron.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lee, for that introduction. So yeah, we're going to talk about some of the nitty gritty of decarbonization, and I think we'll touch on some of the benefits, the challenges, and really getting into what the realities of it are. Fortunately, we have a lot of case study evidence based here in Queensland to really apply that to the working environment for the Whitsundays region. So we'll dive right on how to get the carbon out of Queensland tourism. There we go. And to start off, of course, I want to recognize the spirit of reconciliation, that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. And we pay our respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So a little bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar with EarthCheck. We pride ourselves on being the world's leading scientific and benchmarking certification and advisory group, specifically for the sectors within travel and tourism. So over the last 30 plus years, we've helped businesses, communities, and governments to deliver a whole host of different services to improve sustainability of really any aspect of travel and tourism that you can think of, whether it's individual accommodations, tour operators, entire destinations, and more recently actually growing to entire governments. So it's an exciting space to be working in, and I would argue that probably never as exciting as it is right now, with the world focusing so much on sustainability. So what we bring to the table as far as guidance on sustainability is making sure that the innovations that are happening in the sector are focused on increasing the beneficial side effects of operations. So making sure that scientific data is incorporated. We're all about building capacity, about education first and foremost. And we find that that leads to better management of risks, of future planning and innovation. And then that actually reflects back on the performance of the organization. And I think, obviously, coming out of COVID, the emphasis on sustainable tourism is a benefits to brands like it's never been before. So when we talk about decarbonization, I know that may be a buzzword that some of you have heard here and there, and maybe some of you are kind of like, okay, I've heard it before, but I'm really not sure what decarbonization means. A little bit of context on that. So decarbonization is kind of a one-word catch-all for the process that the global system really needs to transform from its current operations, which are largely based on fossil fuel energy sources, to a net zero carbon emissions future. And so what that means is either transforming where we get our energy sources to more renewable sources that are not producing carbon emissions into the atmosphere and causing the impacts of climate change, or reducing our reliance on energy. So finding ways to be less reliant on energy sources throughout. And so you've probably heard that in the news. Maybe you've heard a minister or maybe even the prime minister say something about affecting climate change, and you've seen some targets either at the national level and sometimes global. It's really something that affects every aspect of the economy more and more. And so it's something that in some ways, certain pockets of industries can say, oh, that's not affecting us yet, so we can still hold out. And I think the best guidance I could possibly give is there's no time like the present. It's so much better to start early than it is to be behind the curve. So just some quotes here from some of the leading kind of business management and advisory groups around the world that, climate change has been in the global consciousness for a long time, but it really took the system shock of COVID to shut down the global economy and supply chains to really let us understand that there are risks that are not currently being accounted for. And so that allows us to really reconfigure our approach to accounting for climate-related risks. And that happens not only in our operations, but how kind of businesses interact. So that's kind of where I see that no one is safe from this. It affects all of us, because even if you feel that your individual operation may not be on the front lines of decarbonization efforts, chances are good that you fit within some larger organization's value chain, either through business customers, through certain target demographics, where this is going to not only be a good thing to have, but a mandatory thing to maintain that business. And that's where I lean towards. We need to be doing this sooner rather than later. And so especially here in Australia, being on the forefront of some of the worst impacts of climate change, it's not just about, oh, this is good for the world or everything. This is good for us. This is good for how our economy works, and specifically in travel and tourism. It's very, very important for what the drivers are for our industry. And so if we want to just drill in, let's forget about the global perspective. Right here in Queensland, these commitments are real. They're on the books. These are targets that we are currently implementing policies and really legislative levers to institute. So we have a target for renewable energy. 50% of all energy used in Queensland should come from renewable sources by the end of this decade. At the same time, we want to reduce our carbon emissions by almost a third based on 2005 levels. So that doesn't seem like that much when you hear, oh, by 2050, we need to be to net zero, but 30% is quite a lot given the current technological capacity. So that's why I'm saying better to start sooner. It's so much better to start before some of these things become less about carrots and more about sticks. So when we talk about tourism, it's often that, oh, I'm not in the mining sector, or I'm not in the aviation sector, and I don't have a big carbon footprint. But when you tie how broad the concepts of travel and tourism are, globally, tourism contributes 8% of all carbon emissions. So that's something that's really, really important. You can say very close to 1 in 10 is attributable in some form to travel and tourism. But at the same time, it's a massive part of the economy. So, you know, billions and billions are generated annually here in Queensland. It's a massive employer in the state as well. So it's balancing what the responsibility is for the emissions generated with the importance of the sector. And that's where I think we need to find that sweet spot. And decarbonization is really a tool for getting to that point. So this is something that the Queensland government, as I was saying, it's something they've set these targets to, and now they're instituting some funding. They want to put systems in place so that we can actually achieve these. So the case studies that we're going to work through today are actually based on $1 million funding for the Great Barrier Reef Islands from 2018 to 2021. That saw us looking at individual islands and the operators on them, as well as the whole of island communities. And so that's kind of run its course. But even just if you're keeping up with the news, another $2 billion was already approved for the reef and its catchment area. And then just this year, another $1 billion was added on top of that. So this is a very much so a point of emphasis, not only for the Queensland government, but for the Commonwealth as well. And so when I'm saying we should look at this sooner rather than later, it's because there are resources available that we should be taking advantage of. But I understand that education has to become a part of that. So on that note, we're going to look at what has been done here in the state of Queensland on decarbonization, specifically of accommodations and destinations. So EarthCheck was fortunate enough to be selected by the Department of Environment and Science to be involved with both a resort island decarbonization pilot study, as well as a whole of island community for 4 of the islands of the Great Barrier Reef. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. So now I'll take a step back and explain how EarthCheck views decarbonization and kind of how our process works. And that'll give a bit of context to what we're going to discuss later. So as I was saying, EarthCheck has a very holistic approach to sustainability. While we're very scientific data driven, it's not just necessarily environmental. There's a lot of social, cultural, governance aspects of sustainability that need to be incorporated. But when we talk about decarbonization, it's really about shrinking that broad view of sustainability to exactly how we can try to limit our impact on climate change by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So when you narrow that focus, we've identified 5 key target areas. And some of these seem very obvious. Energy, we're very familiar with coal-fired power plants, natural gas generations of energy. That kind of makes sense. Waste, you may be familiar with. Waste disposal can generate emissions through decomposition. Transport, we're all very aware of tailpipe emissions from different forms of transport. So those sort of make sense. When you look at climate change resilience and water, those don't necessarily ring a bell of, oh, this contributes to emissions. And it's because they're not necessarily on the front end of climate change, but rather on the outcome. So there's a 2 concepts we need to look about, which is mitigation, trying to minimize the worst impacts of climate change. And that's about shrinking our emissions as soon as possible. But then there's also adaptation, which recognizes that we are already experiencing some of these effects of climate change. And not only that, but we're on a course to continue to feel them for the foreseeable future. And so even with our best intentions to mitigate, we also need to be adapting. And so climate resilience and water conservation are aspects that think of how are things going to look 20, 30, 40 years down the line, and how can I take steps now to prepare for that? And by bringing those 2 mitigation and adaptation perspectives together, it really gives a very holistic approach to decarbonization. So with that concept, that's kind of our dedicated approach to implementing this. But at the same time, we from decades of experience realize that it's boots on the ground. It's the actual community stakeholders, the organization representatives that need to be implementing this. So engaging with stakeholders, learning exactly what the real world implementation would look like. How does it affect current processes, current systems? How does it affect how the organization is positioned now as well as into the future? Because it's something that if we implement it now and there's not a system for maintaining and incorporating it within the organization into the future, it's somewhat of a wasted exercise. And that's what we definitely want to avoid. And ultimately, that leads us to the business case development, which is all about making sure that this is something that fits within how the organization is already working. It's not something that's seen as a burden, but it actually fits integrally with how the organization is already generating value. And that's actually something that we'll get into today. So with that background, we'll kind of dive in. So from our case studies, we've developed a best practice guide that looks at those 5 target areas of decarbonization. But then there's also some other things, including how to go about financing some of these issues. And what about the concept of carbon offsetting that I haven't mentioned yet? So we'll touch on all of these today. So, all right, let's dive right in. So the first key target area we're going to discuss is energy. And so when we think about energy, it's really at the very beginning, it's about understanding where you sit right now. So measuring is the first step. So we all get our energy bills quarterly, monthly, however it's set up for your organization. And we understand that that's what our energy use is, that's what it costs, and that's just an operational cost. So that is how most people get a picture of what their energy use is, but they're developing new ways, and really not so new, but smart meters that give you real-time energy information so you can see how that fluctuates throughout the day, as well as sub-meters, which go beyond just the building side meter or the property side, to get a better picture of individual pieces of equipment that give you a very, very granular level of data so that you understand exactly where the energy is being used for your facility. Once you have that picture, then we take the next step of identifying ways to reduce it. So where can we reduce take care of redundancies? Where can we reduce load? What is something that may just need to be replaced? What is just inefficient? How can we optimize our operations, and where we can't do any of those things? Where are some of the ways that we need to increase our equipment usage through efficiency? And then taking that forward, making that a part of regular inspection and maintenance. And then ultimately, what we're looking for is a transition away from all emissions generating energy, all traditional fossil fuels, to renewables. So we've understood where our picture is. We understand how we want to reduce our reliance on energy in the first place, and where we can't get off of it, where can we transfer that to a renewable source that is not generating emissions. So that can either be on site through renewables such as solar or wind, and more technologies being developed there all the time, or power purchase agreements, I'm sorry, to purchase from electricity utilities to make sure that it's renewable. So some of these technologies, and you'll see some of the prices there, there are big investments such as solar investments, hot water systems that can get very pricey. But then there's much more practical issues for fitting within current overhead budgets with sensors to reduce energy use when it's not being used, timers for equipment that are not needed to be run constantly. Just finding those little ways that you can reduce the emission or the energy usage that may not in each instance be massive, but when you pile them all together for the entire operation, for the entire annual operation calendar, they can make a big impact. And so that's something that you make an investment to increase your efficiency that actually ends up saving resources in the long run. And a great case study of this is the Fitzroy Island Resort, who really leaned into increasing their energy efficiency. So very, very common way is looking at lighting. If you haven't taken a look to update your lighting through replacing traditional electric bulbs with LED bulbs, huge benefits can be had there in reducing your energy usage. And air conditioning, of course, being in Queensland, that's a huge one. So it's not necessarily always about updating to a more energy efficient unit. Reducing the number of units that are used by moving them to shade so that they can work more effectively, and then making sure that we try to minimize their usage when they're not actually needing to be used every moment to moment. These are things that we've seen actually implemented and not only reduce energy usage, but at the same time reduce overhead operational costs. So moving on to water, in much the same way as energy, when you think about water, we need to understand kind of where we sit right now. And I think the biggest threat we have here is leaks. I've seen some wild figures throughout different industry sectors where almost a third to, in some industries, half of their total water usage is just due to leaks, lost water that's not actually being used. And that's not only a waste of a very critical resource, especially in certain areas, but it's a cost. It's an overhead cost that's just being wasted. So making sure that visual leak inspection is included in all maintenance and regular monitoring, and then making sure that you're looking at your water meters to see where the spikes are occurring. Where's an out of the ordinary outlier that's like, oh, where is this coming from? And a big boost to that can be sub-metering, as we discussed in energy. Same thing applies to water. If you have a high water usage thing like a pool, cooling tower, things like that, having sub-meters that know exactly where the water sources are. So once you've taken care of where you may be just losing the resource, finding alternative water sources. So not just relying on municipal water. Captured rainwater, of course, is very, very, very common in Queensland. But then there's also recycled water. So finding ways to reuse shower water and laundry water, whether it's in landscaping, all of these different ways that we can just make sure that we get as much use out of each drop of water really reduces what we're taking out of shared resources. And the ways to reduce that water consumption is minimizing it in cleaning in bathrooms. Kitchens especially can get, that's not necessarily a place where efficiency of water usage is always prioritized. Laundries, of course, are very common, but these are all ways that we can look at water consumption reduction. So some of the technologies there, again, it runs the gamut. Low flow fixtures can be very inexpensive. Making sure that everything has been upgraded so that it is minimally used. You never want to have a toilet that's pumping, liters and liters and liters when it doesn't need to be. Rain sensors are a very useful thing, especially if you're catching with rainwater tanks. And as we discussed, water sub-meters. An aqua recycle is kind of an automated system for some of that recapturing that we discussed. And there's different approaches to that, but some of the ones that we've priced out are much more affordable than, say, a whole of system retrofit. And so a case study that looks at this is Badara Island between Cairns and Townsville, which actually had a desalination system based on diesel power. So upgrading that to a rainwater catchment system, which is no longer reliant on fossil fuels because it's pumped by solar power. And then when the rainwater isn't sufficient, relying on perennial springs in the area. So that's a beautiful example of just rethinking something, thinking outside the box of how it's traditionally been done to find a way that not only reduces your emissions, but also kind of builds that resilience for long-term water sourcing. And so there's a lot of cool things being done out there in the water space. Moving on to waste, you've probably heard the catchphrase, reduce, reuse, recycle. We always like to add a first one, which is refuse. If you don't accept materials in the first place, then there's no waste generated. So trying to work with your suppliers to remove anything that could be hazardous and non-recyclable, making sure that your standard operating procedures and procurement is actively monitoring for reducing package purchasing and reducing that direct transfer into waste. And a lot of that comes down to avoiding plastics. I know it's a very buzzworthy thing to, oh, we want no plastics, but it's really real. It's something that even when you see paper or cardboard straws or metal straws or reusable cutlery, so many places we still see plastics in use. So refusing those is a great first step before we get into the classic reduce, reuse, recycle. Reducing, of course, is making that transition to reusable materials, and a lot of that comes into signage, making sure that people understand what initiatives are in place. And then one that I think is a little outside the box is gardening, right? So food packaging can actually be a huge source of waste just in what the food is transported in and delivered in. So anything that you can grow on site through a garden actually not only reduces overhead, builds resilience, but also affects your waste on the outside. And then compacting systems are a great way to actually build efficiency into the system by making sure that there's not wasted space in the waste streams. So reusing, that can touch on a lot of things. It can be on-site reusing, finding external partners through your supply chain, working with customers on reusability. And then a lot of places we're seeing community groups grow up to help businesses develop these reuse systems. And some of the easiest ones that we have great examples of are crockery and silverware, making that transition from paper and plastic to durable reusables that not only lowers overhead, but also is a great, I think, messaging whenever you're trying to institute these. It's a great show of this is something that we've instituted to this level. And finally, recycling. I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but a big point is really about staff training and education materials for any of your customers. That's the part that is not always included in things, and it really, recycling is only as good as the people that will be participating in it. And so making sure that education is a part of that is a killer benefit. So some of the technologies, composting machines, you can get very affordably, or you can go very, very expensive depending on what your waste stream needs are. And there's a lot of different variability in there. Solar compacting bins, these are actually one of my pet projects. These came out when I was in university, and I did a little research project with them. And so not only taking the approach to efficiency by reducing space within the waste stream so that you maximize the efficiency of transporting waste, but also taking away any reliance on fossil fuels by doing it in a solar powered compacting bin. Those are excellent. Glass crushers are a really cool idea, and you can actually see in the case study for Badara Island, they've actually taken their glass crusher and found a co-benefit with it. So their glass crusher is solar powered, and that converts the glass back into sand, which they then use for on-site concrete development as well as landscaping around the site. So there's a lot of cool and innovative ways to actually implement that for your operation. Next, we want to look at transport, and I know this starts to get not just in-house, but starting to think a little throughout the value chain. But what you can control, what COVID has taught us, if anything, is teleconferencing and telework is something that if you can implement it more, even on a rotational basis, it can reduce unnecessary transport that technology has been able to allow us to do remotely. And I'm not saying that's a 100% replacement at the moment, but it is something that should be considered and can have benefits for the transport emissions. So another way to look at it internally is recruiting locally so that staff are not having to travel long distances. And then there's a lot that goes into active transport. So moving away from fuel-powered vehicles to active transport, cycling, walking, mass transit, things like that. So that's not only the activity, but it's also the infrastructure that goes into it, incentivizing that form of transport if it's not something that's normally used locally. And then a good thing is to consider how that actually plays out in the real world. So if there is an emergency, if someone has an accident, making sure that that's being a part of your emergency response training. And then if your insurance doesn't actually cover that now, making sure that your policy will account for active transport. Some of the technologies, just looking at how you can transfer from traditional fossil fuel powers, solar powered vehicles, electric vehicles, solar boating as well. And then kind of a neat one is biofuels from waste feedstock. So when you're looking into composts and things like that, those can actually be used to develop bioethanols. And that's a pretty cool way to again, get a co-benefit from waste that also benefits transport. So looking at Hamilton Island, they've actually replaced all of the golf buggies with electric alternatives. And then to really reduce private vehicle use, shifted to a fleet of shuttle buses to reduce kind of each individual guest driving their own vehicle. So moving into climate change resilience, this one is, I think, a little more location-based. So when we think about coastal concerns, high insurance premiums are at the top of the list. You know, how are we supposed to operate if the threats of climate change are actually making it not only not cost effective to carry insurance, but in some places being entirely uninsurable. So decarbonization is actually a way to demonstrate to insurance providers that you're taking the steps to build resilience into that, to actually reduce your risks so that your insurance can be adjusted accordingly. Then there's also flooding, as we've seen in Queensland this year. Flooding is very real, and the 100-year floods are happening not every 100 years, but every decade. And so making sure that that's something that we're accounting for. Access to, and a good build off of that is access to energy and water. When there are disasters or severe weather events, how does it affect our access to those necessary resources? And then if for the immediate coastline, erosion is an important one to take into consideration. So just some of the projections out for the end of this decade, more risk of floods throughout the year, higher annual temperatures. We're going to have more exposure to heat waves, and then a greater fluctuation with precipitation, which you see a lower precipitation. But what you can actually read that to mean is that you don't get the normal steady spread of precipitation. You get overall less, but it'll be concentrated in extreme events. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. Those are the things that need to be taken into consideration for resilience. So some of the technologies that we've seen implemented, storm shelters, pre-built ones can vary in size and cost, and really those are not only for staff and visitors to seek in case of severe weather events, but also storage. So if there is a flooding event, storm shelters can also provide storage for necessary emergency response equipment or resources such as food and water. And in addition, in severe instances where there's cutoff lines of communication, satellite phones can be very, very important, especially when you're trying to communicate to emergency response. My organization, EarthCheck, actually developed a crisis-ready app recently that allows organizations to communicate not only internally with their staff, but also to guests. What we've found is in the event of emergency weather events, some of the first stakeholders that are forgotten are guests. They're not from that area. They don't know what the correct responses are. Guests aren't always paying attention to the educational materials at check-in. And so being able to quickly and clearly communicate what the emergency response plans are so that not only your staff, but everyone under your care gets a response. We've seen a lot of great implementation of that and really great feedback from organizations. So moving on from the 5 key target areas, I think it's always important to take into consideration the actual rollout of decarbonization. In many cases, it can be a very significant overhead capital expenditure investment. And there are more and more ways to go about financing that huge investment they're popping up all the time. Here in Australia, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is tied to the government, but it's actually a non-governmental organization, works as a go-between between some of the major financiers in the country to facilitate businesses to actively reduce their energy usage. So across the big banks, there are different programs, incentives, and finance mechanisms that when you can show a demonstrated decarbonization benefit, you qualify for the program, which can be reduced costs of capital. It can actually be financed with a fixed return on investment. And there's a lot of cool, interesting ways that that's being rolled out across the country. CEFC is very, very interested in coastal areas. And so that's something that we're starting to see implemented across Queensland. And for more information, I'm happy to speak on that a bit further. The reef funding program specifically targets reef catchment areas like the Whitsundays, and that's where we start to see that they're actually getting regionally focused for certain ecosystems. Then, of course, there's the large-scale renewable energy target and small-scale renewable energy scheme. Those are not, at last I checked, those are not currently available. But the credits on that system will still be tradable through 2030. And that's something that I would just keep my ear to the ground. That's something that we keep on top of for any renewal on that coming up, because that's something where you get not only subsidizing for your investment in renewable energy, but it's something that can drive value to the organization over the long term. And then there's always grants and funding opportunities popping up, both through the government, non-government. Local governments are finding different ways to be conduits of funding to their local industry. And then there's a concept of energy as a service, which outside groups are finding a lot of private equity and financiers that have targets for their investments that need to be invested in decarbonization efforts, so they can take away that capital cost up front and actually allow there to be a repayment over the life of the asset. And so there's no transfer of ownership of the investment, say it's a solar farm or a water recycling facility. It's still owned by your organization, but you're not having to front the cash up front. So there's always new and exciting and exotic ways to look into this that are being developed at all the time as more and more industries are looking to tackle kind of the costs of decarbonization. And so finally, carbon offsetting. And this is one that usually dominates headlines when we talk about decarbonization is, okay, so here's what carbon costs and here's what it costs to offset. And so I just kind of wanted to go through what the steps are to engage in carbon offsetting. And starting with step one, carbon offsetting is the last step of decarbonization. All other emissions must be completely reduced and avoided. And only the final, absolutely last emissions that cannot be avoided, given current technology restraints or operational constraints, those are offset. So it's not something that you calculate your carbon footprint and then that is the total that is offset. Decarbonization needs to have all these reductions and avoidances first before we get to offsetting. So that's first and foremost the key principle there. So once you've gotten to that point, making sure that you have a clear scientifically based carbon footprint so you understand where your emissions are throughout your organizational footprint through energy, waste, water, transport, as we've discussed. Once you have that footprint, then you can determine, okay, what types of carbon offsets would best fit our needs. So is a lot of our emissions coming from energy? Maybe we need to look into renewable energy. Are a lot of ours driven by waste? Maybe we need to look at forestry and biosequestration or methane, which is one of the byproducts of decomposition. These are some of the projects that you get to determine once you know where your emissions are coming from. And then on top of that, there are a lot of different providers. Last time I did this calculation, we had 70 in Australia. And so I put the plus because I can only assume that that's continued to grow. And so there are a lot of players out there, and really, I don't recommend going outside of Australia. It's something that it needs to be localized, and I would actually say not only localized to Australia, but actually local to your region, and if possible, on your premises. Ideally, that's where offsetting should occur. And then once you've gone through all the 4 steps, understanding actually how to generate a credit off of that. That's where the standards through, the Clean Development Mechanism, Gold Standard, Verified Carbon Standard. These are all verified emissions reductions. These are things that you have to meet very high criteria to make sure that your carbon offset is legitimate. So in some ways, I do mean for that to sound a little bit scary because it's become kind of an area where people that are selling carbon offsets make it seem very, very simple. Oh, you have carbon? Here, pay this amount and you can offset it. And it should never be that easy. That can actually lead to, in many cases, greenwashing, where it's not actually going to lead to what you're being sold. And so it's not necessarily the worst approach. Carbon offsets definitely have their place, especially when we're talking about reforestation and waste diversion projects. There are a lot of co-benefits that come from that, but offsetting is a very, very last step. We have to do a lot of things before we get to that point. So on that note, I've come to the end of my presentation, and so I think I'll hand it back over to Lee.
Thank you so much, Cameron. That was very insightful. I've got a couple of questions myself, but I'll open it to the group first because we've had a few more people join us since we started.
Excellent.
So if there's anyone out there in our audience that would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, please, this is the time. Well, while you're thinking about it, My ears pricked up when you mentioned the insurance providers, Cameron. I was particularly interested because I know that's been a source of discussion amongst a lot of our operators, concern about, ongoing insurance cover. And when you mentioned that their sustainability efforts could possibly offset or help them get cover in the first place, or perhaps reduce premiums, is that what you were implying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to be completely transparent about this. When we started this project, this was not even on our radar. I talk about being in cushy Southeast Queensland. Oh yeah, we have high insurance premiums. No, no, no. Go to the Great Barrier Reef region. That's where the insurance premiums get very real. So we show up as our scientific experts. Here's your energy and your waste audits, and here's how you can reduce your risk. And the number one, without fail, feedback is, I can't even get insurance. I can't even talk about energy or waste right now. If I can't get insured, I can't continue to operate. So that's where we built that approach that is not only, what can you do today to reduce your emissions, but here's where we need to be adapting because the effects of climate change are real. So taking a scientific approach through a systematic way of identifying where your climate risks are. Is it increased risk to severe flooding? Is it increased risk of cutoff from energy and communications and food supply lines? Is it coastal erosion? Things like that. Identifying where your risks are, quantifying what those risks can be, and then implementing systems to manage and ideally remove those risks where they can be or mitigate them as much as possible. That's the system that actually resonates with insurance providers of, especially on a comparative market. If an entire coastline of hotel operators are all facing the same risks and only 2 are taking the steps to measure them, guess who out of that line actually will get a call back from the insurance provider? Or when it comes to rate increases, there will be a premium forgiveness for instituting those things, because ultimately insurance providers are they need to be able to turn a profit on it. And so that's where, if they're providing insurance that they know they're going to lose out on, that's where we start to see a lack of insurance, an uninsurable asset. And so being able to not only identify the risks, but then be able to dedicate specific projects to reduce and manage those risks is exactly what insurers want to see. And honestly, I would be shocked if before long some of these CEFC finance things are not being supported by the insurance providers, because this is exactly the sort of thing that will allow them to continue to operate in at-risk areas, but at the same time have the assurances that they're not going to be just wiped clean at the next disaster.
That's really encouraging to hear that the insurance providers are actually open to receiving those reports from their customers, because I don't think it was that long ago where that wasn't even discussed. It wasn't even considered. So
well, and yeah, you're absolutely right, and I don't think it's goodwill. I think they're being forced to reevaluate the realities of their customer base. When you look at regionally tied insurance, some of the global insurers, they're happy to just pick up and move out. But if you're a regionally based insurer, either you work with your customers to manage those risks, or you find another job. And so that it's kind of one of those things where climate change touches all of us. It's not something that only affects certain industries. Everyone is touched. So it's something that will, I think, only continue to improve there. And that doesn't mean there won't be pain, because if you're not taking those risks, you're not taking those steps to manage the risk, then you fall kind of in a different category than those that are managing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I might hand it over to anybody else out there who would like to ask Cameron a question.
I might jump in if that's all right. Caitlin Ziviani here. Sorry for popping in and out before. Thank you for your presentation, Cameron. I'm just wondering, you have quite a detailed understanding of the different sectors and trends, and I'm just curious as to whether this gets incorporated into, reports or developed into larger bodies of advocacy work, and whether through that, this certification or program has fostered collaborations.
Yes, I can say to a certain level that Queensland tourism broadly across the 13 destination regions are in the process of developing a more coordinated approach to this. I'm not sure if you're familiar. In 2018, Queensland Tourism Industry Council and the state government put together a tourism sector action plan for climate change. And that's kind of been a guiding document that sat as kind of an isolated piece of policy that didn't really translate into anything. It's currently being translated into more actionability for on the ground operators. And ideally, I don't want to go too far, but ideally it's looking to develop policies in the long run that support this these efforts. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that's great. Thank you. I'm also curious as to whether you've found that through programs such as the Healthy Heart, you've had more operators get involved in sustainable practices, or whether off their own bat you've found maybe anecdotally an increase in people interested in offsetting their carbon footprint, or whether that has been through programs and funded initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of, in my experience across Queensland, it comes down to where's their regional support? So where are these topics being discussed regularly amongst operators within, the regional tourism organizations or the local government area? Where have policies and plans been developed so that it is a topic of conversation? It's much easier to start discussions there than where you bring up, say, decarbonization, and a hotelier is, I've never heard that term before. Well, then we have to take a step back and do a lot of education on it. So once the education takes place, then you can kind of have the discussion. Well, okay, so how does this apply to my organization? I hear that this is the right thing to do, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, I still have to turn a profit, and I do want my business to be resilient, don't get me wrong, but this has to make business sense. And that's where we've seen this approach kind of as developments in not only technology, but in finance options be developed, that it is easier to take it from, here's what you should do for your energy and waste, and here's an actual business plan for you to be able to reduce your overhead through increasing efficiency and get a realized return on that investment. That's a much easier conversation than, please do this for the environment. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you so much, Cameron.
Yeah.
So, Cameron, I'm probably under Grant, but it's Lindsay here. I'm a tourism operator. And that's really interesting, because I think in some ways Healthy Heart, we've jumped into something that, we want to understand. But going back to what you were saying about decarbonisation, to have a more general education, because a lot of tourism operators, I guess I'm speaking mainly for ourselves, but is still trying to understand what it is before we get to that business plan stage, right, and before we, because that's what we want to do. I mean, we want to run eco tours, we want to have people interested in the environment, but how do we get the business plan to match with our marketing objectives and for it all to line up, I suppose?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the future of that for Queensland tour operators comes in having access to the necessary tools to understand your current setting, right? So you really need to understand where you are right now before we can get into how do we develop that business plan. So you probably noticed at each of those 5 decarbonization target areas, there was a measure. You need to know where you are. So where is your energy being used? Is it all through purchased electricity from the grid? Do you have fuel purchases for generators or an in-house fleet of vehicles? Where's the energy coming from? Where is the water being used throughout your operation? Knowing where your snapshot is allows you then to identify where are we doing well and where are we doing poorly. And that identifies where the best investments can be had. So if you do have a very energy efficient business, that's probably not the best place to, solar might not be the best investment for your organization, But if you do have a lot of transport emissions, if it is something that, you know, we're heavily reliant on a fleet of boats or a fleet of vehicles, that's probably the better place to get it. So I think today I really wanted to talk through where do emissions sit in most organizations, and it's in those 5 areas. And if you have that understanding, then reviewing how you're managing those. So how are you managing your electricity purchasing, your fuel purchasing, and monitoring its use? How are you monitoring your water? And is that being actively monitored? Are you noticing when there's heavy fluctuations? Do you have a system in place to identify where those fluctuations may be the source of a leak or an inefficient equipment piece? By understanding where in your organization to look, it gives you a better, I think, approach to managing it internally, which then we can go to how do we improve? Does that, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue for us with sailboats is that the cost of electric engines, because our biggest problem is the fuel.
Yep.
And
Yep.
we have deadlines. We've got to get to Whitehaven and back for a sunset, for instance. So
right. Yep.
we can't just be sailing along, taking 5 hours to get anywhere. But the cost of electric engines are, according to my husband, about $300,000, like almost the cost of the boat.
I've seen that. Yep,
Same
I've seen that.
problem with cars, I think.
And I think that's where, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to say we're not being helped by the government in this way to transition to electric engines.
Right, and I honestly, that's where I think Whitsundays is doing a great job, because you're exactly right. It's just one voice, and it's really hard to get your voice heard when it's just saying, hey, this is my business's problem. But when enough businesses are saying the exact same things, that hey, we all have the same challenges, it's a lot easier to get, you know, a minister's attention, or to get an investor's attention to like the Clean Energy Finance Corp, to say, okay, this is something where we're not only, you know, 300,000 is a lot for a single business, but it's a pittance for a huge finance corporation. If they can go in and spend a few $1 million and cover multiple businesses and actually see the emissions reduced across an entire sector for your region, that's something that actually gets raised. And that's, I think that's what Whitsundays is championing right now, is bringing those voices together so that it's not just a one-off concern, but it's an industry-wide concern that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
But thank you for bringing that up. That's, you just hit the nail on the head. That's the whole point of what we're trying to do with decarb.
Thanks, Lindsay. Okay, well, we're getting close to finishing off time. We may have time for one more quick question. No, nothing from you, Olivia.
No, I'd just like to say thank you to Cameron, really, more than ask a question. I think it was really useful, and it ties in really well to where we are at with our Healthy Heart partners, to give people some really good ideas on next steps they could be taking, and what they could be looking at in their business now that a lot of them have finished their baseline carbon emissions calculations. So no, I think it fits in really well, and yeah, thanks for the insight. And I suppose, Lindsay, yes, we have heard lots of people say the same thing, and it does seem to be the gap. The technology is still expensive, and to be able to actually start to tap into it and get it out on the ground is the problem. So that's, at the moment, that's the gap, and we're well aware of it, and we are trying to find that solution. So we are trying to advocate for that. And you know, and I think other countries have done that. So I know in other countries they've had really great uptake through incentive programs. So that's really the way that we've seen these technologies be adopted in places like Sweden, is because they've got such great incentive programs to get the technology on the ground. So hopefully we'll see that come through soon as well.
Thanks, Olivia.
Thank you.
And thank you, Cameron. I hope that everyone has obtained some useful insights from Cameron's presentation. If anyone would like to provide any feedback on today's webinar, please send us an email. The Climate Hub is working with council and industry on mitigating and adapting climate change. So if you are interested in more information about what we're up to, please head to the Whitsunday Climate Change Innovation Hub website, and also follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our newsletter. We will be sharing the recording shortly on the Hub's website, and we do intend to keep diving into this topic further. So we'll release information on our next webinar very soon. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Cameron.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you. Thanks, Lee. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.